喂，我哋人數可以。
We've already formed a quorum. Please invite the guests to come in.
喂，走啦你，副主席。哦，唔係啊，留會㗎啦。今朝留咗會啊，今朝。啊。我哋人數夠啦，我哋可以開會，歡迎兩位局長。
We've already formed a quorum. We can start. Welcome the two bureau directors and their teams. I won't introduce them one by one, as we're all very familiar with them. We now proceed to part 3 of the chapter. We're now jumping from land to sea, right? I'll invite Mr. Kenneth Leung, our lead member, to lead us efficiently in order to complete our hearing on report number 59, chapter 2. As the chairman said, we are to proceed to part 3 this afternoon, and we hope to complete chapter 2 today. Part 3 is on emission control of marine vessels. May I refer you first to Figure 1. Figure 1, you see the light green part by marine vessels. You have a checklist there. For SO2, marine vessels take up 48%, and for nitrogen oxides and PM, so they also take up a huge percentage. In part 3 of the audit report, we can divide the issues into finer details. Hong Kong vessels and the different types of diesel used. And then control of dark smoke by marine vessels. I'll follow the sequence in asking the administration questions. First of all, may I refer you to page 30 of the Chinese version. There you can see the emission control standards internationally for marine vessels. There are 4 different percentages. My understanding is that they're all related to percentage of sulfur in the emission. May I ask the Bureau or Department to explain a little bit on the standards of 2005 and 2010 in application to Hong Kong marine vessels? First of all, I'd like to know which standard has statutory backing. I understand that the 2010 standard does not yet have statutory backing, but has already been implemented in Hong Kong. Who will answer this? Secretary, perhaps I should say a few words first, and then the Director of Marine can supplement. As Mr. Lee said, at present, when the Marine Department exercises its statutory power, in regulating and inspecting ocean-going vessels, it uses the latest standards adopted by the International Maritime Organization. Any vessel that is substandard can be held in custody until the situation is improved before the vessel is released. There is an issue here. For the IMO's 2010 standards, they have not been included in our laws. Now, this is pointed out in the audit report. On the part of the administration, we agree that we might not have worked hard enough in amending our laws. I think 8 to 9 items of legislation have been amended in past years, but perhaps back then we did not deem these new standards very imminent. We agree to the recommendations of the audit report. Will proceed as soon as possible to legislative amendment. We hope that within this legislative session we can introduce to the Economic Affairs Panel of LegCo the proposed amendments. In the course of legislative amendment, we'd consider whether or not we can adopt the direct citing approach such that any updates adopted by the IMO could be introduced into our laws as soon as possible, because every now and then the IMO affects new standards. In 41M, 43M, subsidiary legislation is mentioned. So can the Bureau Director, whether or not they're going to amend the principal ordinance or the subsidiary legislation? Perhaps our Deputy Secretary can supplement. Who will answer? Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Concerning the honourable members' question, will amend the subsidiary legislation, that is 41.3M. Well, that will be easier then. On page 32 of the Chinese version, it's mentioned that actually in 2009, the administration already knew that the subsidiary legislation had to be amended before law enforcement can be done. Now, if the 2010 standards are exceeded, how will you do law enforcement? There are two problems here. Well, from 2009 till now, you have plenty of time to amend legislations, but you did not do so. Secondly, what's your legal basis for law enforcement at the moment? If you want to fine a vessel owner, if the 2010 standards are not met, what laws will you invoke to prosecute the parties concerned? Secretary, well, before legislative amendment, how are we going to enforce the law? I'll defer to Mr. Liu for the details. To answer Mr. Leung's question, from 2009 to this year, the administration amended 9 pieces of legislation, and some legislative exercises are underway at the moment. At that time, we're of the view that for IMO 2010 standards, if we were to introduce the latest amendments into local laws, we acted too slowly. That's true. But that does not mean that in enforcing the relevant standards, we could do nothing, because all ocean-going vessels plying in Hong Kong do not just come to Hong Kong, but to other places as well. So, in reality, they've already satisfied the IMO 2010 standards. As I said, the Marine Department is using the latest standards of the IMO in port regulation. Any substandard vessel will not be allowed to leave Hong Kong. In the long run, it is necessary to reinforce the standards in our laws. Kenneth, I'd like to follow up. Secretary, when you do legislative amendment, do you consult the industry? Because this is a major area of our economy. Ocean-going vessels include containers and the container industry. You've not been doing this for such a long time. Why? And now you proceed to amend the legislation. What's the basis of this exercise then? Did you consult the industry? Will these ocean-going vessels also go to Singapore, Taiwan, or even Japan, United States and Europe? Have you considered the possible impact of legislative amendment? You have to strike a balance. Just now you only explained the past and present situations. Well, for ocean-going vessels, they don't just come to Hong Kong. Internationally, in many other jurisdictions, well, Hong Kong is also a signatory to the IMO, so we have to adopt international standards as well. Of course, for local standards, if they are to be applied to local vessels or river trade vessels, then as the chairman said, if some vessels are to visit the PRD region only, if they do not satisfy local and international standards, what should happen? There may be a problem. Ask the Director of Marine to explain the standard of law enforcement at the moment. That is before we introduce the IMO 2010 standards are included in our laws. For consultation, we usually consult the industry. For ocean-going vessels, it's simpler because they have to adopt the internationally accepted standard. Director, Mr. Chairman, for ocean-going vessels, they go to all ports around the world. In order to satisfy international requirements, ocean-going vessels have to satisfy different requirements when they visit different jurisdictions. Before we complete our legislative program, these vessels still satisfy international standards. In the past few years, when we inspected these vessels, we did not discover any problem. They all satisfied the latest international standard of 3.5% for sulfur dioxide. As for nitrogen oxides, they also attained the Tier 2 or Level 2 standard. I mean for ocean-going vessels. But for local and river trade vessels, insofar as sulfur content is concerned, as they are already adopting the 0.5% standard, they are already above the international standard. For nitrogen oxides, that is, for Level 2, we are at present liaising with our counterparts on the mainland to include this Level 2 standard in our laws. Earlier, during the consultation period, the river trade vessels were of the view that if we are to do this in our laws, their operational costs may be affected, and we are studying this with the mainland. They are now compiling a study report, which is expected to be completed in 2013, and then Hong Kong will liaise with them in order to legislate to lift the standard. Director, In the past 5 years, what happened to law enforcement? Were there any vessels that did not satisfy the IMO 2010 standards and were fined? How many vessels involved? Mr. Chairman, in the past few years, insofar as port regulation and inspection are concerned, our vessels have no problem. They satisfy international standards. The Marine Department issued circulars to require vessels to attain international standards. As I pointed out, in the past few years, vessels in Hong Kong had no problem. As I said, these vessels don't just come to Hong Kong. Internationally, some jurisdictions have actually directly cited the IMO 2010 standards in their respective laws. So a sulfur content of 3.5% and level 2 for nitrogen oxides had been met. If individual vessels have problems, then in accordance with our inspection reports and under the prevailing laws, we can require the vessel concerned to rectify the deficiency before it is allowed to go. Now, in paragraph 3.8 of the report, it is pointed out that in 2009, 2010, and 2011, the Marine Department conducted inspections of 776, 820, and 854 vessels, respectively. How did you take your samples? What method did you use to inspect these vessels? Director? Thank you, Chairman. In the past few years, we respectively sample checked 700-odd and 800-odd vessels. We would inspect 15% of the ocean-going vessels that come to Hong Kong in accordance with international standards. As to which vessels would be picked, we made reference to the inspection results of international maritime organizations. That means the vessels with poorer performance will be checked more frequently. I have no more questions, Mr. Chairman. I'll hand the floor over to other colleagues. In 2010, we have 33,000 ocean-going vessels and 179,000 river trade vessels coming to Hong Kong, and then 25,000 local vessels. Have you carried out any economic study to see how legislative amendments will impact on various sectors of the community? If you have such a study, please let us have the results, because this is very important to our economic development. I mean, as far as vessels are concerned. Mr. Chairman, we may not necessarily have concrete analyses of specific data, but as I said earlier in my reply, for ocean-going vessels, they have to satisfy the latest standards of the IMO. That's 2010 standards at the moment. And other ports have the same requirements. In Hong Kong, we also have the same requirements. It's just that we've not yet formally included these standards into our laws. But the industry itself understands what requirements they have to meet.
For local vessels and river trade vessels, there is the scenario you described. There are two viewpoints amongst the industry. The large companies agree that there should be more work on reducing pollution, but there are concerns that if it's only conducted in Hong Kong, but in neighboring areas such as the PRD, if they don't comply or if they have different standards, then business might decrease. There's a lot of cargo, that a lot of food is also delivered through river trade vessels. So if Hong Kong forges ahead on its own without compliance from neighbors, then there would not be any substantial improvement in air quality. Well, if you have that information, could you forward it to us? Thank you, Chairman. Please refer to page 6, diagram 1. In this chart, vessels are polluting much more than vehicles and are only second to utilities. They also have a lot of particulates and nitrous oxide. The administration has focused its efforts on roadside pollution, but work on vessels is not sufficient. So do you think that we've not focused properly, or we have made omissions? I think you understand that roadside pollution has direct impact on our health. So focus on improving roadside air quality is understandable. But when we look at different polluting sources, then the proportion belonging to vessels will become smaller. So recently and in the future, we will focus on vessels. So, okay. Referring to table 4, page 29, Chairman. If you look at omission quantities from vessels in particulates, this is larger than river trade vessels. Local vessels, we only have some 15,400, but we have 180,000 trips. But why do we have so much more pollution given a smaller fleet? Why are our local efforts not productive? Well, for river trade vessels, you might have to deal with the mainland, but how come? Why is our local emissions so much higher? Mr. MOK, in compiling the checklist, we don't look at the number of fleets or the trips. We also have to look at the mileage it incurs. So in table 4, that's how we came up with these figures. Chairman, I don't understand the explanation. If you take a bus and if you compare it to a weekend driver, that's the difference. Chairman, you are right. The mileage on the sea is long. So we will calculate how much mileage is accumulated. So we don't look at the fleet alone. We have to look at the big picture. For example, container vessels, they have to take many trips to disembark. But for river trade, they might only come to Hong Kong once or twice there. They might only come to Hong Kong every 2 days. Chairman, in our last meeting, we heard about government subventions for diesel vehicle upgrades, but the government has not encouraged local vessels to upgrade the diesel engines. They've only done some pilot programs. After the pilot programs, they haven't implemented, they haven't provided subsidies. So why is so much resources, why are so many resources deployed to roadside pollution but not to diesel vessels? Mr. MOK? If we were to reduce vessel pollution, what would the focus be? Well, if we upgrade the engines, we have to enhance the fuel. So first of all, we have to see how we can improve vessel fuel, and therefore we had done some experiments to see if they can use better diesel fuel. We have some low sulfur fuel where we conducted pilot tests. But if we just focus on harbor ferries and require them to use better fuel, then there would be an extra expense. For example, the oil depot, refuels at these oil depots. But if only a few vessels use that depot, then the cost will be higher. So we have to see whether we can enhance local diesel fuel. And that is exactly what we're doing with the industry. That is, we're trying to reduce the sulfur level in diesel fuel from 0.5% to perhaps 0.05. As to how we can take it one step further and reduce the vessel pollution, then when we introduce a new fuel, we'll have to evaluate the overall emissions. Thank you, Chairman. I understand having a having a good engine but not having good fuel, it still leads to a lot of pollution. But if the ceiling of sulfur and ultra-low sulfur fuel is, we're still much more lax than the mainland. So why can't we standardize with the mainland on low sulfur diesel fuel? Well, the government said that we don't have a lot of users. Of course, it's because you don't make it mandatory. If you require all fleets to use low sulfur diesel, then there'll be more supply and it'll be cheaper. But you don't make it mandatory. That's why it's expensive. Chairman, allow me to respond on the technical issues. We have discussions with the industry whether we should raise it to the level of ultra low sulfur diesel, but the industry is very concerned that if the sulfur content is lower, then it will affect the lubrication of equipment, because they tell us that they are different from vehicles. Vessel diesel might be very old, and if they have such a stringent requirement, it might have an impact on their machinery. We had consulted with Marine Department, and the Marine Department experts also tell us that we have to be careful because the vessels are at sea, and if there's a problem, it could be a dangerous situation. So after balancing all the factors, we feel that we should take a cautious approach, and we also have the industry's endorsement and taking the sulfur level from 0.5% and increase it to lower the sulfur content to 0.05. They haven't answered why aren't we aligning ourselves with the mainland. This is an aging industry. Let me explain the process. We're trying to regulate the industry, and we have a very little experience. We spent some time negotiating with the industry, and vessel emission we're getting their contribution to pollution is becoming more and more clear, but we haven't reached a consensus with society. It takes some time. And lastly, do we need to align with the mainland? Well, the timetable is shortened. If you look at table 6, it's, even though we would like to have less sulfur, but next year the mainland will tighten their regulations. So to a certain extent we'll see some changes in vessel emissions. Chairman, it seems that they can't upgrade the engines, they can't upgrade the fuel, so it seems that we're powerless against vessel emissions. And lastly, a question on fuel. Well, we do have substitutes such as biodiesel. Is that feasible? We've done a lot of work on vessel emissions, so we're not powerless. We can enhance fuel quality, we can upgrade engines, but these need to be feasible and practical. We also looked at ultra-low sulfur diesel. We had done a pilot program, and Mr. MOK explained our pilot program on ferries. It's technically feasible, but we don't have a big fleet in Hong Kong. So if there are different standards, then the vessel industry would find it hard to comply. The fuel used in Hong Kong comes from Singapore. We understand that the chances of having a supply of 0.05 would be higher. So we would like that to be the vessel fuel standard. If our pilot succeeds, there's still more work ahead of us. Well, if we want to upgrade the engines and so on, it would depend on the design of the vessel. We have more than 10,000 vessels in Hong Kong, and some of them are old, so can we just upgrade the engine only? That might not be feasible. So a more practical approach would be to deal with the fuel standards first, especially for long-haul vessels. We would like more regional cooperation. We have some incentives. So if these long-haul vessels come to Hong Kong, they can be exempt half of their fees, We're also working with Guangdong Province, where they can have similar arrangements. So that should strike a significant blow against vessel pollution. So the 14,000 vessels, are these the majority of these? Are these old vessels, or how many are new vessels? Do you have that breakdown? Chairman, in Hong Kong, there are more than 10,000 vessels. There are different vessel types. There are old and new. So I don't have the figures. We are aware that some vessels some old vessels are assembled with different components. So if the sulfur content is changed significantly, there might be some safety concerns. On the ferry side, we've done some testing, and so far it's successful, because ferries are new. Most of the ferry fleet are new, and but they do have some concerns. So in this respect, we would like to do more testing. We also need to consider the factors the Secretary mentioned. If we have lower sulfur levels, the costs might go up, because other jurisdictions might not have such high fuel standards. Thank you, Chairman. First of all, these vessels do we rely on monitoring stations to collect their emission data? Well, the monitoring stations, can they accurately capture the fleet emissions on both sides of the Victoria Harbour? We have river trade vessels in Tuen Mun and so on. So these average figures, are they reasonable? Do we have roadside monitors on the sea? The whole air quality monitoring network, we have different sources in Hong Kong. We have roadside pollution, we have vessel pollution, utility power generators, emissions. So we have a whole portfolio. Some monitoring stations location will be closer to vessel activity. For example, Wai-chuen in some Shui-fu. These are closer to the sea, and at the same time they can track vessel activity. So if you look at air quality monitoring network, we cover everything. In our checklist mentioned, we will look at vessel activity exclusively to come up with a total figure.
Mr. Kam-sing, now this is scientific data. Now I'd like to ask what the members have asked. Now 09 to 12, there were 5 occasions where the Marine Department notified the transportation authorities that it was not possible to resolve the difficulties through legislation. Now, these notices were they general ones which did not immediately lead to legislation, or is it that the seriousness was recognized but certain difficulties were encountered? Secretary, in the past few years,
好似我剛才講呢，就係
as the Secretary said, now the Transportation and Housing Bureau considered a lot of legislation that are related to marine matters which required amendment. There were 9 of them, including 2 bills, amendments this year. So looking at the literature, at the time, the judgment was that if we do not formally incorporate the IMO 2010 standards into legislation, Hong Kong can, through the MD, and Hong Kong being a party to the treaty or the agreement, it can ensure through checks, ensure that the standards are complied with, especially for the ocean-going vessels. So the risk is low. So that's why the amendments have not been put at the top of the list as far as priority is concerned. Now, for the Marine Department, with the issue of these notices, have they considered that in future, when notices are required, should there be some kind of alert or grading that alert people to the seriousness or different level of seriousness? Now, looking at the past, I think we haven't perhaps done as well as we could have. So in the future, in the enforcement of air quality standards where they affect ships, we will ensure that they are in compliance with the latest IMO standards. Now, the IMO from time to time amends different standards, some in connection with safety, some in connection with other matters. Now, if we amend local legislation, every time they make an amendment, it takes a lot of time and a lot of preparation work. So we are now working with the Department of Justice to see whether we can adopt a certain method of immediate reference. So when there is amendment by IMO, we can do it without the need for immediate legislation. But we try to ensure that local legal requirements are in keeping with the international agreements to which we are party. Now, I'd like to come to paragraph 3.16, now requiring that local and river trade vessels adopt the use of ultra-low sulfur diesel. The progress has been slow. Now, looking at the past, in 2007, they already tried out using fuel of 0.05%. Now, at the time, the usual usage was 0.5%. It was light diesel oil. Now, in 2007, that was 5 years ago, they studied using fuel of 0.05%. Now, was that too ambitious and not in keeping with reality, or was it that the international standards was raised and we should have done it, but because of lack of legislation and lack of timely amendment, that we have been slower than other countries? Is it that we have been slow, or was it that we were too aggressive at the time? Anissa? Now, Chairman, in 2007, when we reported the pilot testing scheme to the environmental panel it was in relation to the ferries. Now, as for applying 0.05% to ferries, was it too ambitious? We don't think so. Now, the government fleet has been using the 0.05% standard for a long time. Now, the land vessels has already adopted high standards, and government fleet has also adopted the 0.05 standard. So why apply it to vessels? Because vessels they travel frequently. They apply our harbors, so we think we should apply it to them. So we went through a rather comprehensive testing, and we found that for the ferries, they are not the youngest fleet, but they can provide adequate service, and if they do not use the certain kind of fuel, then the cost may be very high. We studied the matter with Marine Department. If we apply ultra-low sulfur diesel to all vessels, is it feasible? Because and also for local vessels, there are many kinds. Some are more aged, and some are newer, but there are quite a lot of old vessels. So after studying it in connection with Marine Department and in connection with the trade, we try to upgrade from 0.5 to 0.05, but it's not up to ultra low sulfur diesel. Now, so from going from 0.05 to 0.05, now that's appropriate. Now, as for going to 0.005, now you can demand that for local ferries, but as for the suppliers, now, I mean suppliers of fuel for local vessels, if you want to reach the standard, does that mean you have to change your suppliers so that new suppliers can offer to supply the fuel that you are studying? Or is it that the additional handling fee even for the new suppliers, because there's more work involved, there would be a 21% increase in the cost of fuel, Anissa? Now, the 21% increase, that's especially with reference to logistics, because for ferries, the supply of fuel, they have special arrangements with certain different suppliers. They have special facilities in order to supply such fuel. Now, if the other vessels adopt a certain fuel standard, and if the ferries adopt another fuel standard, then the cost would be very high in the handling. So, if it's special purpose for the ferries, then there would be handling charge, higher handling charge for the suppliers. Also, para 3.17. Now here you mention a 0.05% test scheme, and it said that this test is being conducted by the university to help local ship operators to use fuel of 0.05. Now, earlier in the document, you were talking about 0.005% for ferries. Now, at the time, did they fail to examine at the same time local vessels other than ferries? Did you conduct the technical feasibility? Now, why is it that suddenly you come up with a study scheme for sulfur diesel content 0.05%. That's 10 times higher now, and the study will be completed only in 1 year on. Now, earlier you studied the feasibility of fuel that's 10 times lower in sulfur content, and now you're going back to 0.05. Now, so and that study will only be finished in the first quarter of next year. Now, 0.05, that study was conducted and completed for ferries, and we found that if we target only certain kind of vessels, then because of the market situation in Hong Kong, the handling charge would be very high, and ultimately the fares for the users, the public, would be raised. Now, we agree with Mr. Leung Sing. Now, if 0.05% low sulfur fuel is operable for ferries, then 0.05% can be applied to ordinary vessels. We are quite confident about that, and we want the public, the trade also to share our confidence. So we share this with the trade and with Marine Department, and we agree that in order that the trade is also confident, we would do it for 0.05%, and it's not just ferries but other vessels. Now, ferries and vessels other than ferries, can you tell us the ratio of emissions? Now, for ferries, they have larger engines, so compared to other local vessels, they have higher emissions. But how do you compare in specifics? It depends on the vessel, the size of the engine, and so on. So there are different vessels involved. Yes. Say the vessel, if the vessel is smaller, in the case of ferries, it depends on whether we are talking about the same category of engine, is it newer design or older design. But in general, if the similar technology, then the ferries are large, they use larger engines, so they have high emissions. Now, on para 3.19, now, in Table 6, we can see some countries already adopted higher, more stringent standards. And for those nearer to us, the mainland in 2013, starting from July 2013, the mainland will apply an upper limit of 0.035% sulfur. That's a higher standard than ours. So would that now, for mainland vessels coming to Hong Kong, would that have a favorable impact? And when will you be able to make a forecast? Now, small? Yes. Now, 0.035 and 0.05, that's quite near. Now, if it's 0.05, the oil company, to ensure that they won't exceed the standard, so in fact, all the supply is closer to 0.03. So, in general, we would pay close attention to the air quality monitoring stations, and in future, if we upgrade in regard to the ocean or marine field, and that would also be reflected in our monitoring station. Now, if the mainland applies higher standards, then the impact will certainly be positive. But the two types of fuel do not differ greatly in fuel content, as I said. Next, Alan, and then Kenneth. Chairman, I would like to ask, now, in the Audit Directive Audits Report 3.9. The Marine Department raises views to THB on several occasions, and the THB did not follow up. Now, if you look at the audit report, in October 2008, the EPD and Marine Department already informed that the Environment Advisory Committee that Hong Kong will adopt the IMO 2010 standards. Now, that was 2008, and that was almost 4 years ago. Now, when we were talking about Chapter 1, we know that nitrogen oxides are an important air contamination agent, and the vessels, the ships emit a lot of NOx. And in 2009, now the EPD informed the Marine Department that given the polluting nature of NOx, there should be early application of the Level 2 NOx standards. Now, before coming to a conclusion that the THB completely ignored Hong Kong people's concern about the ship-emitted pollution causing damage to our health, and before faulting the THB for that, I'd like to give the Secretary for Transportation Housing one more chance. Now, in 2003, the letter in the list was received, and if it said that there wasn't sufficient legal basis for applying the IMO 2010 standards, and you said that law enforcement would be difficult because there wasn't sufficient legal basis. Now, after you received that, up to October 2009, what did you do in the months after you received that? Now, if we look at the situation in the past few months, as I said earlier, it's true that with regard to an amendment of legislation, it was rather late. A lot of time was spent in discussion, but the consideration, looking at the literature back then, there was quite a lot of legislation that's connected with marine matters, so it's a matter of priority. And at the time, the judgment was that ocean-going vessels in Hong Kong waters basically comply with the latest international standards. I'm referring to the IMO 2010 standards. And as the director just explained, the current legislation already authorized Marine Department to adopt the latest standards to conduct checks for our harbors. So that's a way to enforce the standards. So that's why we haven't placed the top priority on legislation. Having said that, I don't think that's an ideal situation, and as I said, we will try to implement the legislative amendments as early as possible, and we will discuss with the DOJ. There will be direct reference in order to quickly implement the IMO standards. Now, the witness is repeating himself, Mr. Chairman. Now, if indeed the Director of Marine Department thinks that he already has sufficient tools to deal with these NOx emitting vessels, he wouldn't have written to you.
That's why I'd like to ask the question. I don't want to waste too much time on this. Now look at this table from A to B, 7 months, C to D, 7 months, D to E, 10 months, and then another 2 months after E. That is from D to E, 2 months. I'd like to know whether there were priorities for March 2009 when the Director of Marine asked for help in terms of law enforcement. Were there any other pieces of legislation that were even more important, such that we won't be too harsh or unreasonable to you? Well, I'll go back and compile a list on the number of legislative amendments on maritime matters since 2009. In paragraph 3.14b, as explained before by the Director, they would like to consult the electrical panel on economic development on the amendment proposals in the 2012-13 legislative session for the purpose of incorporating the IMO 2010 standards into the local legislation. So can they give us a rough timetable? If we are to support them, there's no reason for us not to support them. After introducing the IMO 2010 standards, what support could be offered by legislative amendments? And then in accordance with the new standards, in what way are you confident that you can enforce the law? Secretary, Mr. Chairman, we're the port regulator, and we've always been enforcing the IMO standards, so we don't have much worry about law enforcement. It's just that we have to amend the laws, so we need to have an amendment bill and have to first obtain endorsement from the relevant panel of the LegCo. And procedurally, we have to consult the organizations of the trade. Again, any timetable? We hope that within this legislative session, that is within the first half of next year, we would like to go back to the panel. Mr. Chairman, why am I asking this? Even if we are to include IMO 2010 standards into our law, we can see from the later table that for the two pieces of legislations, principal legislations, that is ordinances, they're actually different from other transport laws because the dark smoke emitted must be impacting on the environment first. And as prosecution action has not proved to be very successful, after enforcing the law and taking out prosecution for 1.5 years, they just gave up. And then they were not even adopting the Ringelmann chart for measuring dark smoke emissions. So how can we be confident that they can enforce the IMO 2010 standards? Can the Bureau Director give us more details? Secretary, I think Mr. Leong was correct in saying that we should adopt a comprehensive approach. I thought that we would later discuss dark smoke emission. That's why just now I mentioned it. In fact, all signatories to the convention have to adopt the same standards. So we have to introduce the standards into our own laws. As for local and river trade vessels, the IMO does not have any specification for the signatories. Individual signatories to the convention can formulate their own laws. They can be harsher or more lenient. As for dark smoke emission, in the past few years, we had received a number of views from the industry. As for the Ringelmann chart standards, we did consult the industry. In 2007-08, we did consult the industry on the standard to be adopted. And then back then, the industry was of the view that our standard was rather harsh because in other jurisdictions they adopt a level 2 standard. Anyway, we would like to include all these recommendations in the proposed amendment bill, and so we'll include these in our paper to the panel as well. Yes, I welcome this approach. That is, we should adopt a whole basket of standards. Mr. Chairman, I think for this part of our report, we should give more details. If you're committed to this, Chairman, you'll recall that on Saturday, I also asked this question. For our vehicle fleet, some old vehicles will only be replaced in a few years' time. And then we were told that those were special vehicles, like fire services vehicles, heavy vehicles that are very expensive, so they should last for a few more years. Now, after finishing vehicles, we proceed to government vessels. In paragraph 3.21, in the last part of that paragraph, it said that the Marine Department informed Audit in August 2012 that most of the engines of the remaining 116 less 56 government vessels were more than 12 years old, and it might be more cost-effective to replace them when they reached the end of their useful lives, that is 15 or 20 years, depending on vessel types. If you're not just paying us lip service, can you advance the replacement of these vessels? Or are you going to tell us that these are operational vessels that have to last a few more years? Director? Mr. Chairman, for these 60 vessels, most of them are general vessels. Of course, some belong to the Marine Police. Some are special vessels. But in general, there are patrol vessels and general vessels. Usually, we replace such vessels when they reach 15 or 20 years old. Well, if these vessels had to be replaced earlier, the Marine Department would try to cope. Well, Mr. Chairman, on Saturday, we're talking about buying health with money. So usually that approach will be supported by LegCo. Well, we'll write this into our recommendations. Oh, yes, if the administration wants us to consider this a positive approach, then before we complete our report, the administration should give us another timetable for the replacement of these vessels. So that is, we should replace them earlier. Paul? Yes, Paul first. Mr. Chairman, perhaps I should turn to another issue. May I refer you to Schedule 7? That is dark smoke testing. May I know the procedures and time involved, and may I know the details for each and every type of vessels? Marine Department. Chairman, let me give a brief reply first. In the past, we conducted 8 tests, visual tests. But without the Ringelmann chart as our statutory basis, we cannot say that according to the Ringelmann chart, this is against the law. We could not say so, but we conducted visual tests. Well, basically, every year we conducted 1 to 2 tests. We made arrangements to inspect the vessels, and each test lasted 2 to 3 weeks. We would see whether or not the tested vessel exceeded the standard. If a vessel's emission exceeds a particular amount or a particular concentration, for example, in 2005 we tested over 5,000 vessels, about 1.5% of them, that is about 80 vessels, exceeded the standard. That is equivalent to about level 2 of the Riggelman chart. And 75 of those 80 vessels received an advisory from us, and 5 received a warning, and there was 1 prosecution against 1 vessel. Prosecution has not been easy, but in the successful case, the vessel was fined $2,500. So that's roughly the situation. Well, I asked the director a simple question, but he gave me a very detailed reply. So he's actually a very good witness. Perhaps I should cut up my questions into different parts. I would like to know the procedures involved for which vessel, for each vessel. That is, for how long the visual test lasted. Well, if a vessel continuously emits dark smoke at a certain concentration for 3 minutes, then it's in excess of the standard. That is against our rules. Well, I'm not familiar with the situation. You said every year you carried out about 2 visual tests. So you select a certain monitoring stations, or you picked certain vessels for the test. How did you conduct the survey? Mr. Chairman, may I defer to my colleague who's more familiar with this? Mr. Chan? Perhaps I should briefly introduce the test to members. Just now, the director said that every year we carried out 1 to 2 visual tests or visual surveys. We divide Hong Kong's waters into 4 regions, and for each region we have a continuous survey for 5 days. We held the Riggelman chart and carried out sample checks on the vessels. If we could see that some vessels emitted smoke, some not. And if a vessel was emitting dark smoke, we would time the emission and the concentration from 0 to 1 minute, 1 minute to 2 minutes, 2 minutes to 3 minutes. We also recorded the level of emission and took photographs. And then we'll pull together the information and data. For the minor breaches, we would issue an advisory. For serious cases, we issued warnings, and for the most serious cases, we took out prosecution. Well, we could see that at Potoi Island, your vessels chased after the breaching vessels, the vessels in breach of the rules. Please don't mind my asking such detailed questions. I think you're correct. Such tests were not easy. Some vessels might be moving, some might be berthing, some might be leaving the terminal. We do not target a particular type of vessels. It depends on which type of vessels is found more in a particular region. Now, in 2010, you surveyed 2,498 vessels, 2011, 2862. Do you differentiate these vessels from PRD or what? Well, in our records, we do have breakdowns with OGVs, ocean-going vessels, river trade vessels, and local vessels. There are 3 types of vessels, and we'll put on record the number of the vessels involved. And every year, we do produce statistics. Here in this table, we do not break down the categories of vessels. For each vessel, how much time did you spend on tracing and testing that vessel or surveying that vessel? Well, it depends. If the vessel is moving, it's more difficult to carry out the survey. If it is stopping, then it's easier. So sometimes we may be tracing the vessel for, say, 5 to 10 minutes. Then we'll be able to complete our visual survey. Well, did you analyze why the number of vessels surveyed in 2010 and 2011 were far more than those in previous years? Well, in 2010-2012, we surveyed more vessels. That's a fact because we had more human resources. Prior to that, we had less manpower. In 2012, up to August, the number of vessels surveyed is apparently something to be proud of. And the percentage of vessels with visible emission is as low as 1.2%, which is very successful. Can you explain that? Mr. Chairman, perhaps I should say this. We started the survey in 2007. And you see that the percentage of vessels with visible emission has been dropping all along from 2007 to 2012. And the measures we adopted proved to be effective, in particular for river trade vessels. They made more improvement than ocean-going vessels and local vessels. They adopted measures to reduce emission. And in our routine contacts with industry, we understand that they're all concerned about the environment. Now, in 3.30, we see that there's only one prosecution with a fine of $2,500. Why so few prosecutions and why so low the fine? Mr. Chan, if you don't have the information here, you can give us a written reply later. As we said just now, the 2 ordinances, Shipping and Port Control Ordinance and Merchant Shipping and Local Vessel Ordinance, have to rely on a nuisance element for prosecution. That's why we don't have any objective norm in law enforcement. When our law enforcers observe dark smoke emission, it's rather difficult to quantify the emission. That's why we would like to include the Ringelmann chart in our laws so that we can have an objective standard for law enforcement.
Just now, the prosecutions over the last 2 years and between 2007 and 2011, there were 5 cases, and the prosecution figures are on the low end. Mr. Chan talked about a subjective standard, and in the early years, we observed smoke emanating from vessels, it started from 40% and we're now at 1 or 2%. So there has been some improvement. We do require our colleagues, when they grant licenses, that the vessels need to comply. So there is an improvement. Referring to paragraph 3.28, you don't have the use of the Ringelmann chart, but in fact you are using the Ringelmann chart to issue warning letters and so on. Chairman, we would like to implement the Ringelmann chart, but before it's available, we still have some principles. So when we prosecute, the judge can decide whether it is a objective standard. So, setting aside the Secretary's reasons, that is, there are other more important maritime legislation to deal with, why is the Ringelmann chart being used so long, but it's not part of the legislation? Regarding the Ringelmann chart being added to legislation, it's not because there was a lot of maritime legislation amendment, but rather industry feedback. As the director mentioned, we still rely on the Ringelmann chart for licensing and other requirements. In black smoke inspections, so we don't have a objective standard, so we have to rely on visual checks, and that would lead to prosecution difficulties. So I agree, we should include the Ringelmann chart in our legislation. The industry are comfortable with Shade 2, and Shade 2 is also used in the UK and US. But compared to air pollution control, they require Shade 1. So we had a stalemate on that, and the industry would have concerns if a Shade 1 were to be used. But our initial thinking is to use Shade 2, and that would have more acceptance within the industry. So if you refer to the UK, the fine is £5,000, but the fine in Hong Kong is only 2,500. So is that the difference in fines are too great? So besides using the Ringelmann chart, could we also amend the fine levels to have a larger deterrent effect? Chairman, I agree that in our drafting exercise we also need to consider the fine levels. Director, you are responsible for vessel safety. Do you have an environmental safety certificate? Because vessels need these certificates. They shouldn't be inspected when they only when they emit black smoke. You do have safety equipment, safety vessel certificates now. So do you have an environmental certificate as well? If not, why so? Chairman, there isn't any international convention on black smoke, but for vessels, they do need to meet environmental criteria for local vessels. So that means you don't have one. Long-haul vessels, there are some certificates. For local vessels, there isn't a specific requirement. Does the Environment Bureau have any requirements? In air pollution, international vessels, they need to have an air pollution certificate. In Hong Kong, we have a Hong Kong anti-air pollution certificate. Mainland vessels coming to Hong Kong, they have a similar certificate, but it's not going to be called the Hong Kong Air Pollution Certificate. Well, that means you must have examined these vessels. Thank you, Chairman. Black smoke arises from poor maintenance. We have an annual inspection requirements. They need maintenance, and if maintenance is not up to requirement, and there's not perfect complete combustion, that will lead to black smoke. So the Environment Bureau, Environmental Department, do they liaise with you? It doesn't matter. The three secretaries, the trio, can work on it. This is important because it's the way forward. They can work on the same standards. Regarding the environmental certificates, my colleague can elaborate. We have the 2005 and 2010 standards requiring the vessels to meet sulfur and nitrous oxide emissions, but black smoke is a different issue. I'm not referring to black smoke. I want to know if there is a certificate that states that they are the vessel is not polluting. Well, the vessels need to be certified seaworthy, but if it's polluting, that's very problematic. So, is there a certificate that solves part of this problem? And the three departments can work on this. The international vessels, I understand. I'm referring to the local vessels. They have a Hong Kong anti-air pollution certificate. So what does it regulate? For example, on each vessel, each piece of equipment has a certificate. So you have an anti-air pollution certificate. So if there is such a certificate, then they should have this black smoke problem. Ocean-going vessels, river trade, and what about local vessels? On what grounds is this certificate issued? It regulates carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. There is a procedure for inspection. They have to comply with all these parameters. So when that engine has that certificate, and when we inspect it, when it's in compliance, grade 1 has been, we had grade 1 requirements enacted since 2008. If the vessel does not have adequate maintenance, they might not comply. There is an annual re-registration. Kenneth? The industry does not object to using the Ringleman chart, but whether the controversy is on whether shade 1 or 2 should be used. But there are other air quality regulations where if we use shade 2, then it would be different to other air control regulations. So if we are to update legislation regarding the Ringleman chart, how do we deal with the separate standards? As Mr. Leung said, if we are to legislate regarding vessels, we propose using shade 2 of the Ringleman chart. Of course, this is different from shade 1 in air pollution control regulation, but if we use shade 2, this is in line with other international ports. And second, there is some difference between ocean vessels and land vehicles. But if we can garner industry support and introduce objective tools such as the Ringleman chart, that was an important first step. Of course, I feel the Ringleman chart is an objective standard. It should be part of the legislation. But if we have one standard for vessels, and if this is different from other air pollution control regulations, I'm concerned with the difference in standards. In the drafting of legislation, we have to iron out these difficulties. In our air quality controls regulations, the legislation deals with land facilities and not ocean equipment. We're talking about two issues. Legally, will there be a difference in standards? Under the air pollution control regulations, we are regulating land activities, doesn't include ocean activities, so there's no conflict. Second, we believe that, as the Secretary explained, land equipment and ocean equipment are different, and the Marine Department, they have complied with the international practice. Well, if a vessel is berthed and they're next to a port, are they considered to be on land, or is it on sea? There's a vessel berthed on land. Usually, when it leaves the port, they have to activate the engine, so they won't come under the air pollution control regulations, because our air pollution control regulations deals with land activities. So if it's berthed and the engine is activated to generate electricity, we have a lot of overseas ports. They are required to use local electricity. They cannot generate their own electricity. That's what Mr. Leung is asking. Have you done that? Because that creates a lot of pollution. Power utilities, when the vessel is berthed, when they generate electricity, these are large generators. So for ocean-going vessels, whether they need to use the land grid, or whether it's overseas or advanced country, this is just at the initial stage. Not too many places require the use of the land grid, the local grid. I read an article where using the land grid reduces a lot of pollution. That's correct, Shannon. I'd like to follow up on another question. Paragraph 3.20. An incentive scheme for ocean-going vessels. The scheme was launched on 26th of September. So does the department have any figures? How many vessels have used the scheme? The incentive scheme was launched on 26th of September. And up till the 12th of December, 2.5 months, we received 682 applications. Only 30 were declined because of insufficient information. Some 90% are being dealt with or have been approved already. 682 applications. How many of these were ocean-going vessels?
For that period, there were about 5,800 ocean-going vessels in Hong Kong. So for the 680 odd applications, that's about 12% participation rate. Chairman, I think that's a low participation rate. Now, last time we talked about switching to LPG for PLB from diesel. Now that's quite low, and now you are going to do it with $260 million, and yet the rate is very low. So is there a way by the administration to try to make it more effective? Chairman, now this scheme has been in place for only 2 odd months, so it's relatively new. Now we trying to do it first by promotion with the large shipping companies to ask them to participate, and then secondly we have a long-term target through legal requirement. We require that if they come to Hong Kong, the large ocean-going vessels, they have to comply. And as for why the participation rate is rather low, our preliminary analysis is something like this. Now, first, it's like the vessel switching fuel arrangement. This is voluntary. Now, the rebates will reduce cost by 30 to 50% of the birthing cost, the cost after birthing. So it has to do with the choice by the shipping company. They look at their cost situation and they also take into account the environment. And also, as for our subsidy, our incentive is 30 to 50% of the additional cost. So for the participating companies, they still have to pay a cost. So that's why maybe some of the shipping companies do not participate. Now, in the long term, if we make it a legal requirement, all the ocean-going vessels coming to Hong Kong have to comply, then we think it would be more effective. Now, in the last hearing, Mr. Leong said that it seems that the ball is being passed to LegCo again. Now, we do not have a stick against these polluters. They won't participate voluntarily. Now, we come back to the basic issue, that is when you design the carrot, is the carrot sweet enough? Now you waive 30% of the dues. Now Hong Kong government is quite rich and wealthy. Now when you come up with a scheme, your design of the carrot is very important. It will directly affect how many people will comply with the scheme. Andrew, now on the amount of incentive, if we're going to raise it, we consider the pollution pay principle and the possible reaction by the companies. So that's how we came up with the design of the current scheme. I hope members would understand. Now we ask for this switching of fuel on birthing. We are not the first in the world. In North America and in Europe, they also adopted legislation to force the ocean-going vessels to adopt low sulfur diesel once they berth. Now, that will reduce pollution. So we can do it by legislation. But at this stage, we like to communicate more with the industry. Now, as Mr. Anthony Cheung just now referred to, if we, provided that we do not affect the competitiveness of Hong Kong port and we can work with the Pearl River Delta ports, then the effectiveness would be more pronounced and there would be greater reduction of pollution. Now, Chairman, now as for other ports of Pearl River Delta, as of now, do they have a requirement for switching to fuel upon berthing? Now, to our understanding, in North America and in Europe, they do have some legal requirement for switching fuel upon berthing. Now, for Asia, there is no legal requirement yet. For Singapore, they have something similar to ours, that is, they offer incentive for ocean-going vessels to switch fuel upon berthing. Now, that was voluntary too. Now, in some other countries, now they do not have money, so if you do not comply, you would be fined. Now, here our Treasury has lots of money, so we offer incentive. So that's why it's different from North America and Europe. Christine? Now, I'd like to correct what you just said, Mr. Chairman. Now, I'm not saying that it's because the economies are not as good as ours. I think that's not correct, because for Northern Europe and North America, they focus on public health. They want to reduce emissions, so they have a set of legislation, not just switching fuel on berthing. They have a whole series of measures. So it's not just because of money. Now, you have described the problem. Why is it that others can do it, and why do we sacrifice the health of our public and we don't do it? Is it that they are more capable? Now, I am obliged to say this because of what you said. Now, why do we give incentives? It's our public's health. Why is it that the Hong Kong public's health is of lower worth than in North America? Is it that the government hasn't done its job? May I have a little bit more time? Now, if you look at Europe and North America, several years ago, before they legislated, they also offered incentives. They paid money. So they found that under the voluntary incentive scheme, the success was not that great. Now, something like the 12% in Hong Kong. So if you adopt a voluntary mode, it won't be all that successful. It has to be mandatory. Now, after they legislated, that has improved. Now, in Hong Kong, where's the problem? Now, we're talking about Hong Kong competitiveness versus people's health. So we have to attach more importance to health, and we have to provide more comprehensive data. Now, if by 2012, which is a target that we mentioned, if we can have within our own waters the requirement for switching fuel upon berthing within Hong Kong, how much would public health benefit? Well, if you are talking about the European or North American experience, now they have traveled so far already, and they well, why is it that we had to do what they already did long ago? Why do we have to go and do what they did earlier? Why can't we go right away to the next stage? Why is it that we can only do it by 2015? Now we smell all this unhealthy air these days. Now we fork out 260 million to provide incentive. Now, they didn't succeed, so why do we adopt the same incentive arrangement? Our objective is legislation, so I hope other bureaus and the industry can agree to this earlier. It's been 3 years since 2009. Now, Mr. Leong asked, now it was in March. They already wrote a letter to the secretary, please legislate. And in September 2012, only then did you introduce the scheme. You didn't legislate, and you try to pay to buy support. Now, the legislation is different from that of 2009. Now, in 2009, IMO 2000, now it's not that part. Now, I'm talking about the whole concept of legislation. Chairman, we discussed the 5 representations, that's IMO. Now, I understand that's the spirit of legislation, but this is part of the whole. Now, as for this switching of view upon birthing, we completely agree. If there is to be effective application, we must have legislation. In Europe and North America, it's the recognition within the region. In Europe, it's the EU. In North America, it's not just one port, it's the entire North America ports. We're talking about a single atmosphere. Now, we already raised this to the Pearl River Delta governments, and this is part of the quality life circle. Now, we first introduced the incentive scheme as a first step. Now, can we just legislate by ourselves first here in Hong Kong? Technically, that's possible. If society feels the same, we can follow up on this work. But if only Hong Kong legislates, now it's not enough to reduce air pollution. Looking at this chart now for marine vessels, SO2 48%, NOx 32%, PM10 36%. Now, can we tolerate that? Can we wait longer? Can we wait for other jurisdictions? Why do we have to follow others? Why can't we pay for better health of the public? Now, I think this is a policy issue. Now, I'm not the government, so I merely raised the issue. I hope you would explain. Mr. Sheikh, now, with your analysis, I feel that you have already asked the questions that I would like to ask. Now, maybe other members, Alan Leong has a question. Alan? No, Chairman. I think I completely agree, and I feel the same as you do. I think that having listened to the 2 bureau secretaries and the directors of departments, I think they know that not enough has been done in the past. Now, we have listened to the witnesses on chapters 1 and 2, the Environmental Bureau Secretary and the THB Secretary and the 3 Bureau Secretaries. They will work as a group. They said that they would provide a more positive response to the health of the public. Now, Christine LOH has made it very clear whether it's in the design of the air quality objective. All this should be linked to the public health. And when we write the report, we will attach importance to the need to spend the money earlier, not when people have already entered hospital, to achieve better air quality. Now, that's our main direction. Now, Chairman, I have a few minor questions. Now, firstly, I'd like to ask, now, for the Kai Tak Cruise Terminal, for that terminal's design, now, in the development panel and in the Finance Committee funding process, I remember that the Kai Tak Cruise Terminal has its power generation complex. Now, is that oriented towards ocean-going cruises berthing at Kai Tak? They must take their electricity from our cruise terminal generator. Andrew, Mr. Director. Now, for the Kai Tak Cruise Terminal, the design has allowed for space to provide on-land electricity supply. Now, as for when the supply would be available, now I believe that the relevant authorities are considering that, because this is a rather avant-garde approach, advanced approach. So it depends on the ocean-going cruises, how many of these large cruisers have this type of equipment, because apart from the supply of electricity on shore, the cruisers themselves have to have the right equipment. So they're trying to gain more understanding in this regard. Alan. So if possible, of course I hope that since we already allowed for such facilities, then we should actively study the new facility at Kai Tak. Also in para 3.37, we see that there would be this black smoke spotter scheme, and this has been stopped after 13 months. Now looking at 3.36, it's said that the reason is rather discouraging, because the number of spotters have numbered 100, but successful prosecutions were very few. Now, the secretary said that he's thinking of legislation, and maybe the wrinklement chart shape 2 would be incorporated as a legal requirement. Now, would you resume the smoky vessel spotter program? Secretary, Mr. Secretary, if we apply the wrinklement chart standards into through legislation, and as in the audit report said, we would reconsider applying the smoky vessels spotter program again. Now, same as for spotting black smoke from vehicles on land, we have to study the training of the spotters. Finally, I'd like to ask about the sulfur content, even though just now we used quite a lot of time on this issue just now. Now, before you are able to legislate, and if you still apply the money for health concept, now would you consider for the waiving arrangement, would you waive a larger amount? Because as Chairman pointed out in chart 1, table 1, whether you breathe in suspended particles or nitrous oxide, the ships are a very major source. Now, if the amount of waiving is increased from half for all the vessel, for the dues that the vessels have to pay. Now, if you increase the waiving to 80% or even 100%, would you get sufficient support? Mr. Secretary, now this is under the ambit of the Environment Bureau. Now, I think the public health is a very important consideration for us. Now, as for mandatory switching of fuel. If we do it unilaterally, we can choose to do that. Now the trade has told us that because the other Pearl River Delta ports do not have this requirement, many vessels would leave us and go to them, and will be affected right away.
港口都冇咁嘅要求嘅時候。
And then if our neighboring ports do not have the same requirement, there would not be too much improvement to our ambient air quality. That's why the Permanent Secretary for Environment said that we are now striving for regional effort. But of course, if we fail in that regard, we'll have to consider other alternatives. Alan, what about port facilities? How much will they cost? At present, per 100 tons, we charge $43. It depends on the size of the vessel. Bigger vessels will attract a higher charge, which can be as high as over $10,000. Well, Mr. Chairman, if we're talking about thousands of dollars to over $10,000, if you reduce the charge by half, it's not too much difference to the Treasury if you totally eliminate it. So will you consider abolishing the charge? That is, you are paying for public health. Otherwise, you'll only be placing your money in the beds of public hospitals. Professor CHEUNG said that you're worrying about economic benefits if you mandatorily require vessels entering Hong Kong waters to change fuel. So will you consider fiscal incentives? Bureau Director or Director? Mr. Chairman, Mr. Leong. Well, the incentive scheme has been in place for about 2 months. For the time being, we understand how effective the incentives are. So first of all, we have to enhance communication and publicity such that more vessels will know of the scheme and participate in it. Then the scheme will be more effective. I think we believe that the more effective method is legislation. So we're expediting our legislative program. So on the one hand, we enhance publicity and education to attract more participants. On the other hand, together with the Guangdong province, we try to expedite our legislative program. So we would do our utmost to safeguard public health. Alan, they cannot legislate on their own. You have to understand that not all vessels in Hong Kong waters berth at piers because we don't have enough pier facilities. Many vessels just berth at sea. So there's a problem in law enforcement. If you understand the number of vessels in Hong Kong waters from day to day, you'll see the size of the problem. For new ocean-going vessels, if you read marine magazines, most of them have converters. If you take a cruise, say in Mediterranean Sea or North America, all vessels berth at piers have the device. In Hong Kong, if you look out from your window, you see a lot of vessels are actually berthing at the buoys. Maybe the director can explain why law enforcement has been difficult. Director of Marine. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At present, some of the vessels berth at buoys, their midstream operations. This incentive program covers all vessels berthed at piers in Hong Kong, as well as vessels berthed at other facilities. And all vessels can apply for the concession. Alan, well, I've spent 16 years in shipping, so I know a little bit about this. Whether a vessel berths at a pier or at a buoy, the vessel has to continue to switch on its engine to generate electricity. That's why we have the figures in Table 1. Am I correct, Director? You can explain to us the details. Now from Table 1, you can see there are many marine vessels in Hong Kong. We're not looking at a partial picture. Well, Mr. Chairman, I understand. The Secretary for the Environment said that he would like to go it by way of legislation. The question is when? Well, he said as soon as possible, in 2012, 2013. Did I misunderstand him? July 2013. Well, they said that they would go to the Economic Affairs panel. But will the legislative program be led by the Environment Bureau? Is my understanding correct? Secretary, Mr. Chairman, let me clarify. In this legislative session, we'll go to the Economic Services panel for the inclusion of the IMO 2010 standards in our laws and to include the standards of Regulation chart in local legislations. As for the mandatory program for switching fuel, we have to do it on a regional basis, which will then be more effective. I understand that the Environment Bureau has already commenced discussion with Guangdong. Why so long? For ocean-going vessels, if we can reduce pollution in Hong Kong, why can't we do it ourselves? Why do we have to wait for others? Because pollution is continuing. Even if we are to reduce pollution by a fifth, it will be a big contribution in pollution reduction. Mr. Chairman, before the Secretary responds, I'd like to refer him to Table 6. In July 2013, they're to reduce it to 0.035, which is better than 0.05. In July next year, when mainland drops to 0.05, then we no longer have any worry, hidden worry, right? Well, we would like to introduce the IMO 2010 standards into local legislation. Secondly, we'll have to work on dark smoke emission. And then for local and midstream vessels, what sort of regulation do we want? The last one only relates to Hong Kong standard. But for mandatory switching of fuel, we're discussing with the Guangdong side in the hope that we can have some common requirements on both sides. Alan, any more questions? No more. Then we take a break of 5 minutes. Then we come back for the last part. Yes, we come back at 4:45. All right, a break of 10 minutes. All right, a break of 10